All rise, we will obey. The International Criminal Court is now in session. Lord Joint Court Panel International at Uwait. Please be seated. We will, sir.
Judge Motok, good morning, everybody. Court officer, could you please call the case?
This is the situation in Libya in the case of the prosecutor versus Khalid Mohammed Ali Hishri, case reference ICC 0111-0125, and for the record, we are in open session.
Judge Motok, thank you. I would like to welcome everyone to this second day of the confirmation of charges hearing. I would like to, first of all, ascertain with the parties and participants if there had been any changes to the composition of their teams. I would like to start today with the defense. Counsel, Mr. Hassan.
Changes, but if we can finish today, we will be finish all 4 hours today if it's possible.
Judge Motok, thank you very much, counsel. I now turn to the legal representatives of victims. Have there been any changes in your team, Madame Pele? Madame Pele, thank you, Madam President. No, there have not been any changes. Thank you. And finally, for the OTP, counsel.
Good morning, Madam President. There are no changes in our appearances.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Judge Motok, thank you very much, Deputy Prosecutor. As I said, we are now commencing the second day of our confirmation of charges hearing. We shall continue today with our arguments on the merits, and I now hand the floor to the OTP. Please take your time to set up, and I think that we shall finish or wrap up at about midday. You shall have the entire session of this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Your Honours, my name is Diane Looping. I appear on behalf of the prosecution. I'll be addressing the crimes of enslavement and persecution, starting with enslavement, count 13. Sorry, Madam President, I appear to have some problems with the... No, now it's working. At Motiga, there was an institutionalized system of enslavement, so that even where different people suffered from multiple and different forms of exercise of powers of ownership over them, many of their descriptions of what they suffered and the acts of their different enslavers were consistent. The controls to which enslaved detainees were subjected and their corresponding deprivation of liberty and autonomy went far beyond those of any lawful prison facility and instead amounted to an exercise of powers of the rights of ownership over them. P943, a female detainee in the women's section, described Khalid al-Hishri's controls over the lives of women and children in the women's section, including her own, all detailed in the pre-confirmation brief. She concludes, and I quote, "Khalid al-Hishri was my nightmare. He showed me what hell was. I was beaten and tortured for no reason. Al-Hishri is more than evil. He is almighty," end quote. Controls over the lives of men and boys in other parts of Motiga were similarly all-encompassing and indicative of their enslavement. One witness, who was a detainee enslaved in many ways, including for forced labor, was a capo. As you have heard, capos were enslaved detainees placed in charge of other detainees and forced to facilitate crimes committed against them. He explained why he became a capo, saying, quote, I did my best to survive in prison, and I had to show that I was obedient, end quote. P498 described one of the many common experiences of controls over all detainees, namely deliberate starvation and how this deprived them of their autonomy. Quote, "It is a policy in Matiga prison to starve you to the point where your only focus is what I will eat today. They want you to forget about everything else, your family, your work, your whole life. You can only think about what you will eat. My thinking became limited when I was detained. I even forgot about family visits. I lost hope, and the same of my family," end quote. As witnesses collectively describe a living hell, a struggle for daily survival, controls over detainees' liberty and autonomy in essentially every aspect of their lives, even their thoughts. This was the grim reality for all enslaved detainees at Matiga. From their viewpoint, their enslavers, including Khaled al-Hishri, literally became all-powerful, able to control their lives and exercise powers of ownership over them in a very systematic and deliberate way. Your Honours, I will be first highlighting some key points relevant to understanding the scope of the crime of enslavement in this case, and will then look at examples of key categories of enslaved detainees. First, to better understand the scope of enslavement in this case, I will address briefly 4 points: who the enslaved detainees were, where they were held and enslaved, for how long they were enslaved, and how the perpetrators enslaved them. First, turning to who was enslaved. The enslaved detainees were Libyans and non-Libyans, including black migrants, namely non-Libyans from East, West, Central, and Southern Africa. They were also of different ethnicities, races, beliefs, religions, ages, genders, and sexual identities. Second, turning to where they were enslaved. Enslaved detainees were enslaved within Matiga compound and in and around Tripoli. Most enslaved detainees were enslaved within the main prison inside Matiga compound. They were also enslaved elsewhere outside the main prison within the compound. For instance, enslaved fighters held in underground bunkers or by the nuclear, enslaved children and adults held isolated in other separate locations, such as in solitary cells or near the Rehabilitation Training Center and mosque. Enslaved children and adults were also used for forced labor in the compound, and enslaved women and girls sexually violated and abused inside the women's section and some inside so-called leisure areas belonging to leaders, including al-Hishri within the compound. Outside Matiga compound, enslaved detainees were also subjected to an exercise of powers of ownership in and around Tripoli. Libyans, non-Libyans, including black African migrants, were taken out of Matiga and used for hostilities. For instance, armament deliveries inside Tripoli, such as at the airport, by the beach, in Al-Kremia, Kremia district, and around, including outside Tripoli, such as at Sabrata and Tarhuna. They were also used for fighting in hostilities, including at the front line in Tripoli, both within and outside the compound. They were taken out of the compound and used for forced labor by the beach road at the so-called leisure farms of leaders such as Kara and al-Hishri. Libyans, non-Libyans, males, females, including children, were enslaved by sexual violence and rape outside Matiga, at the beach, and in the leaders' leisure farms, including that of al-Hishri. Third, in terms of for how long were the detainees enslaved at Matiga? As you've heard, some were held and enslaved just for a few days, whilst others for many years. As ICC chambers have confirmed, including in Ntaganda, there is no minimum period of time for enslavement. Additionally, in this case, even after some were supposed to be released, they continued to be subjected to controls by perpetrators. For instance, those forced to join the SDF RADA, or those forced to convert to the belief system imposed by the perpetrators and then monitored to ensure their continued compliance. In Ntaganda and other ICC cases, it has been recognized that enslavement is a continuing crime. Fourth, turning to how Matiga perpetrators enslaved detainees. Enslavement was institutionalized and systematic. First, the leadership, including Khalid al-Hishri, Kara, and Njim, themselves enslaved detainees through many acts of exercise of powers of ownership over many persons, and forced their subordinates to support and sustain this enslavement system. Second, the enslavement conduct happened constantly against all types of detainees and controlling essentially all aspects of their autonomy. It was often intersectional, in that for all detainees, it was sexualized, gendered in differing degrees, and for many, also racialized. Jurisprudence, set out at paragraphs 86 to 88 of the pre-confirmation brief, makes clear the following points when assessing if a person had powers of ownership exercised over them. First, it is a case-by-case, fact-sensitive test. So what might be an indicator of enslavement in one case, or for one person, can be different in another. Second, indicators are therefore not exhaustive. Third, there is no need to prove any one indicator. And if one or more indicators of enslavement are identified as applicable, enslavement is established. Fourth, this also means looking at any relevant indicators as a whole and in a context, which in this instance is an institutionalized system of enslavement. Fifth, amongst the many indicators of enslavement mentioned in previous jurisprudence, at least 4 are relevant in this case and common to all enslaved detainees, demonstrating how the Matiga perpetrators exercise powers of ownership over them and deprive them of their liberty and their autonomy. But these indicators are mere examples. There are also additional indicators, in this case relevant, for different enslaved detainees, including those enslaved by forced labor or because of their especial vulnerability, both these factors being standalone indicators in themselves of enslavement. I will now outline the 4 key indicators. Turning to the first indicator, Matiga perpetrators, including al-Hishri, exerted powers of ownership over enslaved detainees by exerting controls over personal liberty, physical movement, including through detention and unlawful imprisonment. The perpetrators systematically restricted the detainees' physical movement, including by forcing them to suffer inhumane cell conditions, as was described yesterday. These extreme movement controls were institutionalized. Khalid al-Hishri even rebuked or punished other Matiga perpetrators he thought were too lenient with detainees. For instance, bringing them out of their cells for health reasons. Perpetrators also deprived detainees of their personal liberty and physical autonomy through the unlawful detention and imprisonment. This was systematic in that many were unlawfully imprisoned, arbitrarily detained by being held without charge or without any valid charge, and they were all subjected to the unlawful, inhumane conditions in which they were kept. Many were detained with the very purpose to enslave them. I refer to pre-confirmation brief, footnote 293. The leaders, including al-Hishri, deliberately prevented their release. They decided whether detainees would be released, often ignoring official and judicial release orders. The leaders enslaved by unlawfully imprisoning as many detainees as possible, in part because of financial gain. Turning to the second indicator, perpetrators, including leaders such as al-Hishri and Najim, exercise powers of ownership over detainees by their systematic, constant, cruel treatment, abuse, including torture of all detainees, controlling physical and psychological autonomy. This systematic abuse included regular, individual, collective punishments, daily beating, starvation, deprivation of medication and medical treatment, many forced to give blood for injured RADA fighters. And as will be explained later, this also includes unlawful forced labor. Khalid al-Hishri and other leaders institutionalized these controls by themselves perpetrating this enslavement conduct. And Khalid al-Hishri even violently punished guards and enslaved detainees he viewed as obstructing this type of mistreatment. Turning to the third indicator, Matiga perpetrators, including Khalid al-Hishri, exercised powers of ownership by subjugating all detainees through psychological control, pressure, and coercion, and by using their vulnerabilities, such as race, gender, age, to further subjugate and make these detainees submissive and subservient to the will of Matiga perpetrators. Psychological pressure and coercion was systematic, institutionalized, as the leaders, including al-Hishri and their subordinates, constantly used these same methods, including violence and threat of violence, violent retribution, threat of violent retribution, constant torture, cruel treatment, abuse, dehumanizing derogatory language, pressure by threats or actual harm, including criminal abduction of family members, to pressure the targeted persons to do what the leaders and other perpetrators wanted them to do, and nobody was spared, even children and the elderly. Controls over personal thoughts and beliefs, religious and political, by psychological and physical coercion, including torture. Turning to the fourth indicator, the leaders, including al-Hishri and other perpetrators, exercise powers of ownership over detainees by exerting controls over their sexuality, sexual and gender identity in different ways and in differing degrees, depriving them of their autonomy over sexual and gender identity, sexual and reproductive autonomy. This too was systematic and institutionalized. The perpetrators, the leaders, including al-Hishri, exercised their powers of ownership by controlling and restricting the detainees' autonomy over their sexual and gender identity, by imposing their views about gender and gender hierarchies. In particular, they did this in the following way. First, as you've heard, they constantly used sexualized, gendered, dehumanizing language to control, subjugate, and deprive both male and female detainees of their sexual autonomy. Second, they arrested and punished, including by torture and cruel treatment, women and girls perceived as having jobs that they viewed as inappropriate for their gender, politicians, journalists, singers, footballers, or for behavior that they considered inappropriate for their gender, such as being seen at the beach or using social media. They similarly arrested and punished by torture and cruel treatment detainees whose gender identity or expression was perceived as inappropriate. Women, girls, perceived as being so-called manly. Men, boys, being actually or perceived as being gay or so-called effeminate. Thirdly, they treated as inferior women, girls, based on the perpetrator's views of gender hierarchies. For instance, Hishri transported women and girls like cattle by sticks and ropes. Fourth, they imposed their gendered controls over appearances and dress codes for males and females, with punishments including severe beatings for non-compliance. Hishri even shot a woman for having an item of clothing he found inappropriate. Fifth, they imposed unlawful gendered labor roles. Men used to fight and torture other detainees, women and girls beaten when taken out of their cells to do domestic labor. Sixth, they attacked the sexual and reproductive autonomy of males and females, depriving them of that autonomy by the following. They conducted and ordered sexualized bodily searches that amount to rape and sexual violence. They committed other forms of rape, sexual violence, threats of both during or outside torture. For instance, P439, anally raped by penis by his torturer, was told, and I quote, "You will be under RADA all your life," end quote. They deliberately targeted and attacked genitals, anus, buttocks, alongside gendered insults and other controls over bodies, designed to disempower and emasculate, denigrate, and control men and boys. The perpetrators carried out similar attacks against women and girls, with additional attacks on their breasts, and some perpetrators, including Khaled al-Hishri, by ejaculating over their bodies. All of this behavior designed to control, subjugate, denigrate, reinforce gender hierarchies over women and girls. For instance, when al-Hishri raped one victim, he subjected her to extreme controls over her sexuality and bodily integrity by a horrific sexual assault on her body, described graphically at paragraph 93 of the pre-confirmation brief. Some perpetrators were even notorious for attacking the genitals of enslaved detainees, including al-Hishri. They permanently deprived some women, men, and children of their reproductive autonomy or ability to have children. This includes a child, F3029, raped multiple times by leaders, including al-Hishri. She was impregnated, and al-Hishri brought her to a clinic where she was forced to have an abortion and her uterus was removed. Al-Hishri and others also deprived women and children of adequate food and medicines until some, in desperation, were subjected to sexual violence in exchange for food or medicines for themselves or their children. Many of these detainees were especially vulnerable, which is also an indicator of enslavement. All these groups were subjected to systematic and institutionalized enslavement, and the 4 indicators of enslavement apply to them all. This includes male and female Black African migrants, women and children in the women's section, children in the men's section, boys and youth held apart from others, isolated in special sections, men and boys perceived as or actually gay or so-called effeminate, women or girls perceived as manly. Prisoners held for perceived ideological status, religious, political beliefs, and enslaved forced laborers. Black African migrants were treated the worst. But there were others enslaved. All enslaved detainees were subjected to different forms of one or more exercise of powers attaching to the rights of ownership within the institutionalized systemic enslavement. I will address 2 examples First, enslaved forced laborers. The leaders, including Hishri and other perpetrators, systematically enslaved detainees, Libyans, non-Libyans, including black African migrants of all genders and ages, by unlawful forced labor to serve their group and personal interests, so that forced labor was systematic and institutionalized. Relevant to Indicator 1, they were all subjected to movement restrictions and unlawfully imprisoned. Some, like 1041, were meant to be released, but instead remained unlawfully imprisoned and threatened to be killed to work for STF RADA. Others, including those who so-called volunteered for labor and even blood transfusions for a bit more food or a bit more room in a cell, remained enslaved, so had no free choice. In fact, like all slavery crimes, consent is irrelevant and not possible where the detainee is enslaved. As the appeals chamber in Kunarach confirmed, lack of consent is not an element of the crime of enslavement, because this crime flows from claimed rights of ownership. Relevant to both Indicators 2 and 3, the perpetrators forced enslaved detainees to do unlawful forced labor, help commit crimes against other detainees, do unsanitary or hazardous labor, such as treat contagious detainees, do extremely hard, dangerous labor, such as heavy construction at the leader's private properties, including Hishri, and fight in armed hostilities for RADA forces, including under Kara, and to do labor that exposed them to the greater risks of physical and psychological harm by being forced to move out of their cells into areas where crimes were happening or where they were forced to face violent perpetrators like Hishri. Relevant to Indicator 4, forced labor was also gendered. Men and boys forced to fight or help torture others, the women and girls forced to do the domestic labor, being exposed to greater risk, both genders being forced to do invasive bodily cavity searches amounting to sexual violence and rape, also making them victims as well of sexual violence. And the forced labor was racialized. Black African migrants and other non-Libyans given the worst types of work. Turning to children and youth, Hishri and other perpetrators enslaved children and youth held throughout Matika prison. Children in the women's section and in the men's section, children and youth isolated in separate locations in Matika, including in the children's cell, and others held near the rehabilitation and training center. Children born to enslaved persons in Matika were also victims of enslavement, and I refer to the Coney confirmation decision. All indicators 1, 2, 3, and 4 are applicable to how these vulnerable children and youth were enslaved by institutionalized systematic forms of enslavement. Relevant to Indicator 1, the perpetrators controlled and restricted their movements and unlawfully imprisoned them. Some were even criminally abducted to pressure family members to do what the perpetrators wanted. Others, even those sent by their parents, were also unlawfully imprisoned because of their inhumane conditions, torture, and for some, even rape. Relevant to Indicators 2 and 3, Hishri and other perpetrators exercised powers attaching to the rights of ownership over children and youth by subjecting them to torture, cruel treatment, abuse, and psychological coercion. For instance, depriving all of them of adequate food, medicine, and medical treatment. As one child in the main prison said, and I quote, "We were starving so much that if given the choice between freedom and food, we would have chosen the food," end quote. The leaders and perpetrators also exercised powers of ownership over them by other forms of torture, cruel treatment, abuse, and psychological coercion. Children in the women's section forced to watch their mothers and other adults forcibly nude, subjected to invasive bodily searches, tortured, beaten, and themselves hit, and some tortured and raped. They were also deprived of their ideological autonomy. Beautiful religious recitations that usually give great comfort to Muslims were instead used by al-Hishri as a form of sensory torture. One devout Muslim said it was played constantly, and I quote, so loud the young children always cried, end quote. This also impacted on the ability for some to keep enjoying these religious recitations. For instance, one devout Muslim said that al-Hishri played these recitations whilst he was beating women and girls, including her. She can no longer listen to them because, and I quote, this caused me a trauma. I'm always reminded of the beating, end quote. Al-Hishri also verbally showed that he and other perpetrators viewed the children as enslaved. When he took them from the women's section to the perpetrators' operated school, where they imposed their ideology on them, he said to them, and I quote, you are the Rada children, end quote. Matiga leaders and other perpetrators also exercised controls through indicators 2 and 3 over children and youth held isolated in separate areas. Many of the young prisoners taken to the mosque and for rehabilitation training were tortured by Falca torture method on the soles of their feet, by beating, chastising them to make them obedient, and severely punish them for non-compliance. Young boys kept in the children's cell were beaten and whipped with the PPR if they made any trouble or noise. Leaders, including al-Hishri and other perpetrators, regularly tortured and beat other children and youth in the men's section. One detainee was regularly tortured by suspension torture, beatings, sexualized torture, threats of rape, and hitting of his testicles. Relevant to Indicator 4, children in the women's section, by being forced to watch their mothers and other adults subjected to sexual violence, themselves became victims of sexual violence, and some of these children were raped themselves. Other children and youth held isolated or separated from their parents had acts of sexual violence, including rape, committed against them, including one child who confirmed that he was raped by a Matiga leader, who other witnesses described as a notorious rapist of boys and youth. I now turn, Your Honours, to the crime of persecution, counts 14 and 17. Many detainees were persecuted on different grounds, some intersecting. I will address 3 key points: the counts, grounds of persecution, and who were the targeted groups, intersectionality, how these grounds intersect, and the non-exhaustive numbers of persecuted detainees. There are 4 counts and 4 relevant grounds of persecution in this case, starting first with count 14, political persecution. In this case, all Black African migrants were persecuted on political grounds for being perceived as irregular migrants and as obstacles to what Matiga perpetrators viewed politically to be irregular migration. But it was unlawful for these perpetrators to target any and all Black African migrants for persecution on political grounds by automatically treating any Black African migrant as an irregular migrant because of their perceived or assumed irregularity, as well as by targeting them for especially cruel treatment and as slaves because of their perceived inferiority to Libyans. Persecution on political grounds is not just limited to a persecuted victim's membership of a political party or adherence to any particular ideology, but relates to any difference of opinion over public affairs. Even if a person has no political views, they can still be targeted on political grounds if they're perceived as opponents or obstacles to the perpetrator's implementation of their political agenda. For instance, when one detainee was purportedly facilitating illegal smuggling of migrants, Hishri sarcastically said to her, I quote, "I will do you a favor and put you with your African migrant friends," end quote. For the detainee, quote, "this was meant as punishment," end quote, because all of these black African migrants, quote, "were treated very poorly and considered as slaves," end quote. They were in extremely small, heavily overcrowded cells. Libyan detainees were also targeted on political grounds. For their perceived non-compliance with the Matiga perpetrators' political stance, namely as perceived opposition to the perpetrators' own agendas or interests. For instance, 1026 stated, and I quote, "RADA goes after anyone who's from the east of Libya because they're believed to be supporters of Haftar," end quote. Moving to count 15, religious persecution, Libyans, non-Libyans, including black African migrants, were all targeted for religious persecution. And they didn't just target for persecution those perceived as non-believers or those who disagreed with the perpetrators' practices or beliefs, but anybody perceived as not complying with their practices or views. This also included devout Muslims, some of whom may even have held the same religious beliefs as the perpetrators, but all of whom suffered as well because of the violent way in which the perpetrators imposed their ideological practices and beliefs on all of them. For instance, some devout Muslims, for whom it is important to perform ablutions before prayer, were prevented in doing this because detainees were beaten to leave their cells quickly for prayer. And as explained, all women and children, including those who are devout Muslims, suffered from sensory torture inflicted by Hishri because of the way he played so loudly and constantly recitations on loudspeakers and whilst they were being beaten. Now, to be clear, the torture was not what was being broadcast, but the harsh loudness, constant playing, and connection being tortured by severe beating. Additionally, perpetrators specifically targeted for torture and harsh treatment those that they did perceive as disagreeing with their ideological practices or beliefs or otherwise viewed as non-compliant. This included other Muslims who were adherents of ideological views or practices different to that of the perpetrators, Christians, atheists, those perceived as using sorcery. They forced them to convert, tortured them until they repented and converted, and then monitored them after they were released to make sure they continued to practice the perpetrators' practices and beliefs. One detainee was a Muslim whose ideological views and practices were different to that of the perpetrators. He was tortured by suspension method, beaten, threatened at gunpoint to agree with their different religious views, which he did, stating, and I quote, "I just wanted to survive," end quote. A Christian detainee, arrested and held for his religious beliefs, was forced to do religious activities and tortured, stating, and I quote, "We wanted to show we were making an effort to learn, but it was like ideological rape, forced to attend lecture and perform prayers against our will," end quote. He was mocked by one torturer who said to him, quote, "You are a dog, you are a Christian," end quote. And even after his release, they continued to monitor his forced conversion. Another detainee, an atheist, described how one torturer said to him, and I quote, "You either believe in God or we will lift you to God," end of quote. Turning to count 16, primarily black African migrants were targeted for persecution on grounds of nationality, race, and ethnicity, both males and females. They were targeted for arrest, detention, and severe mistreatment because of their nationalities, their racialized ethnicities as Black Africans not from Northern Africa, and because of the perpetrators' racist perceptions of them as inferior, including because of their discriminatory views that dark-skinned persons are, quote, slaves. And this was also compounded by their perceived status as irregular migrants. They received the worst treatment at Matiga, persecuted by being subjected to physical, psychological abuse amounting to torture and cruel treatment. A female detainee in the women's section described how F3028, a Black African migrant woman, was deliberately refused medical aid by Hishri and died. The suspect said, and I quote, "Let her die. When the angels die, it's better for the, when the devil dies, it's better for the angels," end quote. 595 described the fate of all Black African migrants at Matiga, stating, and I quote, "Generally speaking, African prisoners are discriminated against, so they get beaten more and get treated like slaves inside the prison," end quote. All agreed Black African migrants received the worst treatment. However, there were some other detainees also targeted for persecution on grounds of nationality, race, and ethnicity. For instance, 1710 described how detainees, including Libyans, who were ethnicities that were dark-skinned, were also called slaves and also persecuted. They were treated less favorably than other Libyans. 730 describes how Matiga perpetrators targeted for discriminatory conduct almost all non-Libyans and gave them the worst types of forced labor compared with Libyans. Turning to count 17, detainees were also persecuted on grounds of gender. There were three main categories, namely all women and girls at Matiga, some because of their actual or perceived gender identity, including sexual orientation, such as gay or so-called effeminate men and boys, as well as women and girls perceived as masculine, and all men and boys who were subjected to violence to emasculate or feminize them. These detainees were all targeted by arrest, detention, and mistreatment, including, but not limited to, acts and threats of sexual and reproductive violence. Under Article 7, subparagraph 3 of the statute, gender is defined as the two sexes, male and female, quote, within the context of society, end quote. This reference to within the context of society means examining relevant societal constructs of gender, including gender hierarchies, gender and sexual identities, and gender expressions, and this includes sexual orientation. As stated in Triftera, Article 7, subparagraph 3 must be read together with Article 21, subparagraph 3, to interpret these provisions broadly, inclusively, to include targeting of persons based on their sexual orientation. Likewise, in this court, PTC2 recently confirmed in a decision on arrest warrants against senior Taliban leaders that gender persecution includes targeting of persons based on their expressions of sexuality or gender identity, and this includes sexual orientation. In Colombia, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has confirmed in a number of cases, including the Marco Case 11, that persons targeted because of their sexual orientation and or gender identity or expression are considered victims of gender-based violence. In this case, victims were targeted for gender persecution because of their expressions of sexuality, their gender identity, including sexual orientation, and which were regarded as inconsistent with the perpetrator's views on gender. First, women and girls. Some arrested for conduct viewed as deviating from the perpetrator's views of so-called appropriate societal behavior for their gender. As I've mentioned, some arrested because of their jobs, such as politicians or singers, some because of their public behavior, such as being on social media or being seen with boyfriends. All were tortured and subjected to cruel treatment and abuse in gendered ways, for instance, by the violence that targeted with their breasts, their buttocks, and by vaginal, anal, and the oral rapes, and by the misogynistic references to their gender, such as female sex slaves, thabia, bitch, whore, slut. Some had their reproductive autonomy targeted, such as a pregnant woman who was tortured even after her waters had broken. Some were targeted for sexual violence and rapes. Some raped by Hishri and others at the prison, or in so-called leisure areas or farms. Others, women and girls, compelled to have sexual intercourse to get food or medicine for themselves or their children. As I've mentioned, forced labor was on gendered lines. Some women and girls forced to do domestic chores, exposing them to risks of beatings and witnessing of crimes. And they all had dress and appearance codes imposed on them, which were gendered and which usually involved harsh punishments for non-compliance. Hishri also treated baby boys and baby girls in the women's section differently because of their gender. For instance, he allowed urgent medical treatment for a newborn baby boy, but he denied urgent medical treatment for a newborn baby girl after finding out her gender. She died. Perceived allies of women and girls were also targeted for gender persecution, arrested and mistreated. For instance, victim F2152 was arrested for supporting women viewed by perpetrators as wearing inappropriate clothing. Second, actual and perceived LGBTQI+ persons were arrested, detained, mistreated because they were viewed as not complying with the perpetrator's views and expectations on gender. They were targeted for sexualized torture, reproductive violence, and by discriminatory verbal abuse and threats. One detainee, a gay man, during his torture, was stripped naked, beaten severely on his buttocks, told to repent, asked how many times he'd been penetrated, was orally, anally raped, forced to touch a perpetrator's penis, called a mule, a Libyan derogatory term for a gay man, mocked by others who tried to digitally penetrate his anus. One rapist, after raping him, said, and I quote, "I know many other gays like you. If you stay here, you'll have the same fate as others and be killed," end quote. And a senior Matiga leader said to him, and I quote, "You will never repent. You deserve to be killed," end quote. Others, including P54, targeted for beatings and torture, for being perceived as gay, although he was not, and F3042, targeted for beating, sexual assault, forced labor, for being viewed as effeminate. Third, men and boys were subjected to sexual reproductive violence in ways to emasculate and feminize them. As you've heard in great detail, some were subjected to anal rape, targeting of their genitals, their penis, their buttocks. As witness 1710 said, when he described how he was beaten on his buttocks and his genitals, I quote, it made me feel I was no longer a man," end of quote. Turning to intersectionality and numbers of victims. Many victims of persecution were persecuted on multiple intersecting grounds. Your Honours might decide, for instance, that for certain grounds of persecution, such as religion, in fact all of the detainees at Matiga were persecuted. The prosecution took a conservative approach for its numbers. In the document containing the charges, it was stated that there were at least 138 victims of persecution and that this was a non-exhaustive number. in the pre-confirmation brief stating that at least 173 victims. Like the figure for enslavement, both numbers are minimum figures. In Annex 13, each individual was listed only once and under a key ground of persecution for that victim. However, it is evident from the facts related to each individual victim of persecution that there are intersecting grounds relevant to them. Therefore, the numbers of victims under each count are greater when each individual is counted amongst the intersecting grounds on which they were persecuted. I'd like to show visually how these 173 victims of persecution and certain targeted groups of persecuted persons can be best understood and grouped under each ground. Count 14, there were at least 19 victims on political grounds. Count 15, at least 17 victims on religious grounds. Count 16, at least 47 victims on national, racial, ethnic grounds. Count 17, at least 90 victims on gender grounds. However, it's important to understand how these intersecting grounds of persecution and the different relevant targeted groups intersect. For instance, first starting with Black African migrant men. We listed at least 47 Black African migrant men as victims of persecution under national, racial, ethnic grounds. But these same 47 Black African migrants were also persecuted on political grounds and, like other detainees, on grounds of religion. Second, Black African migrant women. We listed at least 4 Black African migrant women as victims on the grounds of gender. But these 4 Black African migrant women were also persecuted on grounds of national, racial, ethnic grounds, religious, and political grounds. Third, other women and girls accounted for 67 of the listed victims of persecution on grounds of gender. Women and girls were also all victims of persecution on grounds of religion. Likewise, other victims, men and boys, who accounted for 11 of the victims of persecution on grounds of gender, were also all victims on religious grounds, and 8 of them also victims on political grounds. Therefore, it's relevant when assessing individual victims of persecution to consider both individual circumstances, but also relevant types of targeted groups. Your Honours, just briefly looking at the issue of persecutory intent. Matiga perpetrators acted with the necessary persecutory intent when committing the crime of persecution. What does this mean? Like any crime, there is a difference between motivation and intent, and it is irrelevant what the motivations might have been for the different perpetrators to persecute detainees. Some possibly motivated by power, by money. Others motivated ideologically. But the question is whether they intended to persecute and on the relevant grounds. For instance, a Matiga guard who beats a detainee to get them out of their cell, forces them to kneel, to recite the required prayers of the perpetrators, beats them for non-compliance, intends to persecute that detainee on the grounds of a religion. It is irrelevant whether that guard was motivated by their own personal ideology or not. In conclusion, Madam President, Your Honours, there are substantial grounds to believe that these crimes were committed and counts 13 to 17 should be confirmed for trial. I now pass the floor to my colleague, Mr. Hisham Murad.
Judge Martok, thank you very much. Mr. Murad, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, Your Honors. In my submission, I will address Khalid al-Hishri's individual criminal responsibility. The prosecution argues that Khalid al-Hishri is criminally responsible under Article 25(3)(a), B, C, and/or D, as shown on the screen. Based on the evidence, the prosecution submits that there are substantial grounds to believe that Khalid al-Hishri committed the crime charged under all these modes of liability. While noting that these modes are applicable to the facts of the case cumulatively and/or alternatively, the prosecution requests that the chamber confirm each of these modes. This will ensure judicial economy and give the defense an advance notice of the different modes of liability under which he may stand trial. It will then be up to the trial chamber on the basis of a full trial to determine on which specific modes, if any, Khalid al-Hishri may eventually be convicted. This approach is also consistent with Your Honor's recent decision on the confirmation of charges in Duterte case. Before resuming my presentation, I would like to pause for a second and to note that on the direct perpetration mode alone, Khalid al-Hishri personally committed all 17 counts of the charged crimes against no less than 159 victims. This number is only a representative sample of victims that the prosecution has conservatively identified. Looking at the facts of this case, we note that Khalid al-Hishri's conduct under the direct perpetration mode is significant in at least two ways. First, there is not a single crime charged that he did not personally commit. Second, this number of identified victims, while chosen conservatively for the purpose of the confirmation hearing, remains one of the highest numbers of victims targeted by any suspect as a direct perpetrator before this court to date. This makes it clear that Khalid al-Hishri was hands-on in the commission of the crimes, creating a culture of impunity for the alleged crimes and setting a negative example for the Mitega perpetrators to follow. Your Honors, I will divide my presentation into two parts. In the first, and in order to avoid unnecessary repetition, I will focus on Khalid al-Hishri's essential contributions to the crimes, which form a common basis for all charged modes of liability. In the second part, and in the interest of time, I will only focus on three different modes under Article 25(3)(a), as shown on the screen. Our complete submission on all these modes, including also under Article 25(3)(b), C, and D, are set out in paragraphs 154 to 255 of the pre-confirmation brief. I will turn now to the suspect essential contribution. First, Khalid al-Hishri contributed to the commission of the crimes through his exercise of general authority and influence through the Mitega prison. Over 20 witnesses provide corroborative evidence confirming his authority and senior role in SDF RADA and in the prison, as described in paragraphs 158 to 160 of the prosecution brief. At least 5 witnesses stated in clear terms that Khalid al-Hishri was the second in command after Abdul Rauf Kara, the undisputed leader of SDF RADA. Evidence shows that Khalid al-Hishri was not a figurehead. Far from it. Witnesses describe him as a powerful man, as one of the founders of RADA and a high-ranking official, one of the main pillars of RADA, and that he held absolute power. He exercised a role of real power and authority over prison staff, including shift commanders, guards, medical staff, interrogators, arrest units, and all detainees, as set out in paragraph 161 of our brief. Even members of the judicial police, who officially fall under the authority of Njim, the prison director, could not go against Khalid al-Hishri's orders. When they arrested Khalid al-Hishri's friend and seized his animals, Khalid al-Hishri went to the judicial police headquarters, shot at them, released his friend, and returned the seized animals. While the prosecution takes the conservative position that al-Hishri is at least a peer of Njim, many witnesses place Njim under al-Hishri's authority despite his official position as the prison director. Some even say that Njim was intimidated by al-Hishri and that guards and shift commanders were visibly more afraid of al-Hishri than of Njim. In one instance, Njim ordered a detainee to install certain cameras in the prison. When al-Hishri learned about this order, he shouted at the detainee, saying, "This is not going to happen." He ordered him to return to Njim and tell him directly that the installation would not proceed. It was clear to everyone that Khalid al-Hishri's orders had to be followed. Prison guards and even Njim could not overturn al-Hishri's orders. For example, on one occasion, al-Hishri tortured a detainee and left him suspended from the ceiling for hours. His agonizing screams drew the attention of a sheikh from the prison, who came to his aid. But once he realized that this was al-Hishri's doing, he told the detainees, and I quote, he could not intervene because it was al-Hishri who had ordered it. He said he would have stepped in to stop the torture if the decision had come from anyone else. He said that if he tried to help, he risked being hung himself by al-Hishri, end quote. Evidence also shows that when al-Hishri placed a detainee in a cell, not the guards, not even Njim, could remove that detainee to a different cell. Even in matters as minor as opening a closed hatch in a cell door so that detainees could get some fresh air or even switching on a ventilator, guards often expressed their inability to make the slightest change that may appear to alter something that was done or ordered by al-Hishri. When witness B1673 requested from the guards to open the hatch, the guards replied, and I quote, "Sheikh Khalid al-Bouti closed it, and we have no power to open it," end quote. As shown by the evidence, al-Hishri's authority in the prison extended to defy even the orders issued by the Attorney General of Libya. Once, when Khalid al-Hishri learned that the Attorney General had ordered the transfer of a detainee out of Mitega to another prison, he was enraged. He dragged the detainee, tore the transfer order, and told her, and I quote, "You went to El-Sur to complain about us? El-Sur has no power. He is no one compared to us. We have the power," end quote. On another occasion, al-Hishri refused to release B665, beat her all over her body and said, and I quote, "I am Khalid Muhammad al-Hishri, and I am the Attorney General." He then brought her back to the prison where she remained in detention. Madam President, Your Honors, while these were just a few examples highlighting al-Hishri's powers and authority throughout the prison, the evidence collection before you shows beyond these examples that al-Hishri's exercise of authority over detainees extended to each aspect of their lives. He was frequently present, running the day-to-day matters in the prison. Detainees often saw him multiple times per day. He conducted prison tours and cell inspections. He monitored both detainees and guards through surveillance camera. Al-Hishri could decide on the quantity and quality of the food provided to the detainees and on their access to medical care. He imposed severe detention conditions on the detainee and refused any attempt to make these conditions lenient or less harsh. Rather, he often took measures to worsen the detention conditions and increase the detainees' suffering. He denied family visits and imposed harsh punishments. He often chose the type of punishment that inflicted the highest level of pain. In the words of witness 1720, al-Hishri, and I quote, made decision about everything inside and outside the prison, end quote. Likewise, witness 1673 said, al-Hishri managed daily matters of detainees, transferred detainees, and oversaw their torture. His name alone instilled fear among both prisoners and guards. Once, because some detainees made noise in their cell or left the lights on, al-Hishri, as described by witness 650, took all detainees in this cell into the yard and forced them into a stress position. He then walked around and beat any prisoner who could not maintain this position. He would leave the yard and watch from the surveillance cameras and then come back again and beat up any detainee who had left the stress position. As shown by the evidence, Khalid al-Hishri's family empowered him further, especially that his maternal uncle is Dawi Inzam, a senior SDF RADA member. Al-Hishri's two brothers also worked at the prison. In this respect, detainees refer to the Mitega prison as, quote unquote, a family prison, and refer to al-Hishri's family as the ruling family in it. Khalid al-Hishri's own words were illustrative of the significance of his family ties in the prison. When one of al-Hishri's relatives complained to him about how Njim was treating him, al-Hishri told him, and I quote, "Do whatever you want. We are the family that owns this place," end quote. Many witnesses detained in Mitega who saw and observed firsthand al-Hishri's exercise of authority in the prison describe how he was feared by all. Witness B 1685 said that throughout his detention, which lasted for years, he could see that guards were very afraid of al-Hishri whenever he entered. They would do anything to avoid interacting with him. He could go to any cell, take out any detainee. He simply had absolute power. The witness went on to say that al-Hishri was also well known to be quick-tempered and could always grab his gun and kill or shoot anyone he wanted. to explain how al-Hishri's authority was perceived in the prison, witness B569 says, and I quote, "People feared him more than God himself," end quote. Further, al-Hishri had the authority to discipline the Mitiga perpetrators. For instance, he once placed a shift commander and his guards in solitary confinement just because they gave a detainee a phone to speak to his family. Other examples described in paragraphs 163 and 164 in our brief show that he also punished other guards by beating them or even shooting them. Your Honors, al-Hishri ordered guards and other perpetrators to commit violent acts against detainees, including to beat, torture, suspend, to commit acts of sexual violence against them as well. For instance, he ordered guards and enslaved detainees to hang 3 detainees. He prohibited them from giving any assistance of any kind to these detainees. He specifically instructed them not to give them food until they die from starvation. These orders were followed. 3 days later, at least one of these detainees died. Several witnesses were themselves victims of crimes committed pursuant to al-Hishri's orders. I refer your honors to paragraphs 68 and 169 of our brief, where we describe victimization of at least 7 witnesses on al-Hishri's orders. I turn now to Khalid al-Hishri's second essential contribution. He had the unique position of exercising direct control over the women's section. And through that control, he contributed to the commission of the crimes. Over 30 witnesses confirmed this role as described in paragraph 181 to 187 of the prosecution brief. I will only mention a few in my presentation as I go through some of the ways in which he controlled this section. First, he strictly controlled access to the women's section, even when he was not physically present. Witnesses described that al-Hishri had complete control over the women's section. He had the keys to the section. No one was allowed into the section without his permission. The undisputed leader of RADA, Abdurrauf Kara, expressly banned anyone but al-Hishri from entering the women's section, including Njim, the director of the prison. Witness P943, who herself was detained in that section, describes that, and I quote, "Khalid al-Hishri came to the women's section daily. He had the keys to our section, so he was always the one who opened the doors, escorted the other guards in and out. He always said that he did not trust anyone else with the keys." End quote. Another female detainee, witness 1736, says al-Hishri was the only person who decided anything related to the female detainees. This was a common knowledge among detainees. Witness 569 describes that guards were banned from accessing the women's section in his absence, even to serve food. He must be there. Medical emergencies were no exception. Witness B54 describes an incident where a female prisoner suffered a stroke, and with all the screaming for help, no one would dare open the door unless al-Hishri arrived. Being the one controlling access to the women's section meant, in such cases, al-Hishri need to be informed to decide what to do if there is any case of emergency. Witness 665 stated that there was a detained girl who suffered from asthma. The other female detainees in the cell thought she was dead, so they kept banging on the door and screaming that the girl had died. El-Hishri, who was outside the prison at the time, got very annoyed because this incident disturbed him and meant that he had to return to the prison. When he arrived, he threatened the female detainees, saying, and I quote, "If he comes and sees that the girl is still alive, he will hang all the girls outside," end quote. Second, he exercised daily control over the women, girl, and young children held in the women's section. He controlled their access to food and medical care. He determined their detention, cell allocation, and release. He personally handcuffed, blindfolded, and escorted women and girls in and out of the section. He often took them to the areas known as Islamic neighborhood or Zanaklia and participated in their interrogation and torture. He also carried out body searches of female detainees and ordered other detainees to carry out these searches under his supervision while he was there watching. Third, El-Hishri's authority was also manifested in his unfettered power to personally beat girls and women over and over again and in the open, in front of everybody to see. Witnesses describe El-Hishri's beating to women and girls as continuous and brutal. This led witness P1736, for example, to put her thick winter clothing in summer, to protect herself and reduce the suffering from the recurring beatings. When El-Hishri beat her while she had these additional layers on, she suffered, but her winter clothing gave her some relief. Noticing what she did, El-Hishri surprised her the very next day. He came early without giving her a chance to put on the extra layer of clothing, and he beat her severely. The beating was so severe that she was bleeding from all over her body. The next day, he just did the same. Evidence shows that beating was the norm and could be triggered by any reason. Witness 1750 described that, and I quote, "Khalid el-Hishri used to beat the women at dinner time so that they would not make noise at night," end quote. Witnesses describe that women's screams were so overwhelming that other detainees would cry from just hearing the screams. They would cover their ears so they could not hear these agonizing screams. Your Honors, El-Hishri's third essential contribution was that he himself directly carried out many crimes repeatedly on a large scale and in the most savage ways. Witnesses invariably describe El-Hishri as a notorious torturer. P1710 says, El-Hishri tortured detainees barbarically. He would beat anyone with whatever he had in his hands, be it a hammer, a shovel, or a BBR. He repeatedly punished all detainees in a cell or a section for any reason, or for no reason at all. As described by witness 1720, El-Hishri frequently ordered the guards to take out the witnesses and all detainees in his cell to an inner yard. El-Hishri would then order the detainees to lay down on their stomachs and beat them with a PBR while insulting and cursing them. The witness described that, and I quote, "These punishments broke my spirit. They were humiliating and belittling, and I felt my dignity was degraded, especially knowing that I had done nothing wrong," end quote. Witness B571 described that Hishri, after shooting detainees, he often instructed the guards not to give any medical treatment. His brutality is illustrated by the following concrete examples. In one instant, he tortured witness 1685 and another detainee to extract information from them. He beat them with a reinforced metal bar used in construction. The beating targeted the weak points of the kneecaps, elbow, and head. The beating continued until the metal bar bent. Describing the pain he suffered, the witness says he felt as if he was, and I quote, being electrocuted in his brain. He could feel it through his spine. End quote. End quote. After the beating, Hishri was told that the detainee were going to die, to which he simply replied, "Let them rot." Your Honors, on Hishri's orders, witness B925, a former detainee at the prison, was taken to the so-called Islamic neighborhood. There, he found 4 detainees already hung with hooks attached to the grilled structure in the ceiling. While 2 of them had their shoulders dislocated from the suspension, Hishri was simply sitting in front of them eating quietly. The witness describes that he could not believe that someone could calmly eat while facing people hanging and screaming in pain and begging for mercy. When Hishri interrogated the witness, the witness said that he was innocent and did nothing wrong. Hishri reacted to this by ordering black African migrants to hang the witness. The pain from the hanging was so severe that the witness could not take it anymore, and then he started shouting. To this, Hishri simply took his handgun and shot the witness. This bullet, as described by the witness, was a mercy shot, because it was this bullet that made him lose consciousness, and therefore he no longer felt the pain. Madam President, Your Honors, the evidence before you is replete with many, many examples of the violent acts committed by the suspect. We heard over the course of the prosecution presentation when he was chasing a prisoner with a shovel, holding it like an axe, striking the victim until he could no longer move and his blood covered the floor. We also heard that he routinely beat female detainees, and he would not stop the beating until he saw blood. Or when he used the longest BBR to inflict pain on the maximum number of women with each blow. Or when he saw detainees suspended with their hands in front of their bodies. To him, this was not painful enough, so he suspended them with their hands behind their back, pulled their bodies down until their shoulders dislocated. Again, these were just some of the many examples of the violent acts Khaled Hishri personally committed. Your Honors, this brings me to the second part of my presentation, focusing on the alleged modes of liability under Article 25(3)(a). And now I'll start with the joint perpetration mode. On the evidence before Your Honors, there are substantial grounds to believe, we argue, that Hishri carried out the crimes charged in all counts, jointly with other co-perpetrators, including Abdurraouf Kara, Dawi Nzam, and Njim. Abdurraouf Kara is a founding member of SDF RADA and its ultimate leader. He exercised overall control over the Mitiga prison through Mitiga prison leadership, including Hishri, Nizam, and Njim. He personally attended the prison, interrogated detainees, ordered their torture, refused to allow medical care, and permitted violent commission of crimes by other co-perpetrators, including the suspects and Njim. Dawi Nizam, a close associate of Kara and a senior member of SDF RADA. As noted, he is also El-Hishri's maternal uncle. He collaborated closely with Kara and the other co-perpetrators. He helped maintain control over Mitiga prison and the Mitiga compound more broadly. He disciplined SDF RADA members. He participated in the commission of crimes, including by torturing detainees, together with El-Hishri and Njim. Finally, Osama Njim was a senior SDF RADA member and a close associate of Kara. He served, as we heard, as the official director of Mitiga prison. He carried out and supervised many acts of torture and abuse, a fact supported by the issuance of a warrant of arrest against him by this court for alleged crimes of the same nature, at the same location, and within a time frame encompassing the temporal scope of this case. El-Hishri coordinated with his co-perpetrators in imposing and maintaining the system of mistreatment and abuse. This system that they put in place in Mitiga to commit the crimes through a common plan. Evidence shows that the crimes alleged in all counts were committed as part of a common plan between the co-perpetrators with the objective to exercise control over persons in the Mitiga perpetrators' custody or control in pursuit of SDF RADA interests or views and or those of its members, through means such as punishment, coercion, and exploitation, principally at Mitiga prison, but also in other locations in and around Tripoli within the temporal scope of the case. Your Honors, as established by the jurisprudence of the court, a common plan need not be explicit. It can be inferred from the facts and circumstances of the case. In this case, the existence of the common plan is evidenced by the following points. One, the co-perpetrators used Mitiga prison as a tool to serve the interest of SDF RADA and their own. In particular, to punish perceived opponents, to gain money, to have access to free labor, often by targeting Black African migrants, to intimidate persons or to extract information. This is further illustrated by the following examples. On one occasion, Kara ordered the torture of a detainee so that, and I quote, he knows who Rada is and understands the consequences of speaking ill about Rada, end quote. El-Hishri, Njim, and Nizam tortured detainees because they were suspected to be affiliated with rival armed groups. Nizam demanded and collected ransom for the release of detainees. When a relative to one of the detainees criticized SDF RADA publicly, Nizam threatened the detainee that he would place him in a solitary confinement and force him to admit to committing crimes on camera if his relative did not apologize publicly about what he said about SDF RADA. These are simple examples to show how the crimes and for what purpose the crimes were committed to serve their interest as a group or as individuals. Second, the existence of the common plan is also inferred from the systematic nature of the alleged crimes and the prolonged period of their commission. As discussed by my colleague, Mr. van der Werf, there is abundance of evidence demonstrating the systematic nature of the mistreatment of detainees, from their induction, initial torture, and interrogation, followed by conspicuous and sustained mistreatment and abuse throughout their detention over a prolonged period of time. This exemplifies the constant control exerted by the co-perpetrators over the detainees and the persons in their custody and control, consistent with the objective of the common plan. Third, the common plan is also evidenced through the co-perpetrators' own conduct participating in the crimes at Mitiga prison, of which the prosecution has already given many examples during its presentation today and yesterday. This conduct demonstrates that the co-perpetrators had all embraced the common plan and participated in its implementation. And finally, the common plan is inferred by the measures taken by the co-perpetrators to conceal the crimes at Mitiga, revealing their consciousness of guilt of the criminal component of the common plan, and establishing their intent to ensure the continuous implementation of the common plan without any external pressure. These measures included, for example, first, limiting inspection of Mitiga prison by any external organization. When inspection could not be avoided, the co-perpetrators took measures to hide entire sections from inspection, remove detainees in large numbers from cells to give the misleading impression that cells were not overcrowded. For instance, when a human rights organization sought to inspect Mitiga prison, Hishri, he oversaw the removal of almost 200 detained women and children from the women's section to another location, leaving only a reduced number of detainees. He also threatened the detainees that were left to meet the representative of the organization so that they do not report on the abuses that happened in detention. Second, another measure that the co-perpetrators used to conceal the crimes was to posting online videos of confession to unlawful behavior, demonstrating to the public that SDF RADA is a law enforcement agency, fighting crimes in a lawful manner, contrary to the evidence establishing that these videos were made under duress to enhance SDF RADA's reputation. And I refer your honors to paragraph 222 in our brief. Third, detainees before their release were threatened and warned against speaking about what goes on inside the prison and the mistreatment they endured or witnessed. Fourth, on the occasion that family visits were allowed, detainees were instructed to conceal any visible injuries or wounds before they could go and see their families. Madam President, Your Honors, the co-perpetrators jointly control the commission of the crimes. Directly by carrying out the crimes and by contributing to the creation and maintenance of the criminal system at the prison. And indirectly by controlling the organization, including the Mitiga perpetrators, and steering them towards the implementation of the common plan through their senior positions of authority and their ability to punish and discipline the Mitiga perpetrators, ensuring automatic compliance with their orders. As already discussed in the first part of my presentation, Hishri made essential contributions to the implementation of the common plan. Specifically, not only did he directly carry out numerous crimes and played a leading personal role in maintaining the criminal system in the prison, but also he controlled the actions of other perpetrators with access to the women's section. Now I move to discuss Khalid al-Hishri's intent and knowledge. The evidence shows that al-Hishri's various contributions to the common plan were intentional, and that he meant for the crimes to occur, or at least knew that they would occur in the ordinary course of events in the implementation of the common plan. First, for counts 1 to 6, al-Hishri meant for persons to be detained unlawfully in Mitega prison in inadequate conditions and to suffer severe physical or mental pain or suffering amounting to torture. This is evident from the fact that he personally and repeatedly participated in such conduct. He ordered and encouraged others to engage in this conduct. He opposed efforts to make the detention conditions lenient or less harsh. He knew that detainees were provided with inadequate food because he oversaw its distribution. He knew that sick detainees did not receive adequate medical treatment because he prohibited it. Even if he had done none of these things, al-Hishri could still not have failed to see the conspicuous signs of the violent, prolonged, and systematic mistreatment of detainees. Because he was regularly present almost every day in the prison. He was conducting prison rounds, sometimes multiple times a day. He was monitoring detainees and guards in person and through surveillance cameras. He could not have failed to see detainees being tortured in open spaces in prison. He could not have missed the overcrowded cells in the daily rounds he made. Detainees complained directly to al-Hishri about the harsh detention conditions and begged him to change them. He either dismissed them or punished them for complaining. Second, for counts 7 to 10, al-Hishri meant for detainees and other persons in the Mitega perpetrator's custody or control to be raped and subjected to other sexual violence, or at least he knew that this would occur in the ordinary course of events. This is because he himself, again, raped and committed acts of sexual violence against detainees. He was aware of and participated in the pattern of conduct that resulted in these criminal acts being committed, including 1, strip searches and internal cavity examination for detainees. 2, sexualized torture. And 3, the detention of detainees in overcrowded cells and with detainees notorious for sexually assaulting other detainees. Evidence also shows that al-Hishri knew of allegations of sexual abuse done by Mitega perpetrators against other detainees and did nothing about it. Instead, he punished the person that tried to take an action against it by banning him temporarily from coming to the prison and did nothing to the perpetrators. I refer your honors in this context to paragraph 233 of our brief and footnote 1256. Third, for counts 11 and 12, al-Hishri intended or was aware that detainees would die as a consequence of the violent, prolonged, and systematic mistreatment. This is because he himself killed many detainees. His own statements reveal his intention. We heard many of these statements today and yesterday. For example, when warned that his torture of detainees would cause their deaths, he simply said, "Let them rot." Or when he scolded a senior Mitega official for taking detainees out of the cells to get some sun for medical reasons. He said, "What are you doing? You are trying to help them. We are trying to make them die." Or as we heard today and yesterday on several occasions, El-Hishri gave clear instructions not to provide food or any kind of assistance to torture and suspended detainees, so that they die where they were suspended, and die they did as intended. Fourth, for count 13, El-Hishri meant for detainees to be enslaved, or at least knew that this would occur in the ordinary course of events. He knew that detainees were subjected to exercise of powers attaching to the right of ownership, such as acts of forced labor or to give blood, because he exercised such powers himself as part of an institutionalized system. He knew that detainees were subjected to powers attaching to the right of ownership, such as controls over their personal liberty and physical movement, controls over sexuality, sexual and reproductive autonomy, because he himself tortured detainees and detained them unlawfully without due process, and refused their release even when such release was ordered by the Attorney General of Libya, and committed acts of sexual and reproductive violence, including rape, against them. Finally, for counts 14 to 17, Khalid El-Hishri meant for detainees or other persons in Mitiga perpetrators' custody or control to be persecuted. He shared the discriminatory intent to target persons on the alleged grounds. This intent was manifested in his own words and conduct, viewed in the broader context in which the crimes were committed. Evidence shows that Khalid El-Hishri used misogynistic terms when referring to female detainees, calling them names like whore, bastard, and animal, and treating them as inferior. Your Honor, as you heard in the course of the prosecution presentation, El-Hishri deliberately denied medical care necessary to keep a newly born baby alive, just because she was a girl. As a result, she died. In another incident, when a female black African migrant got sick, as we heard earlier today, another detainee informed El-Hishri and begged him to help her. He refused and simply said, and I quote, "Let her die. When the devil dies, it's better for the angels," end quote. Evidence shows that he imposed his religious and ideological views and practices on detainees whom he perceived as non-compliant. Now I will turn to the second mode of liability, and I will be brief in discussing the second and third modes of liability. This mode is concerning direct perpetration. As noted, El-Hishri committed as a direct perpetrator all 17 counts of charged crimes against at least 159 identified victims. He targeted each of these victims with more than just one crime, as set out in Annex 14 to the prosecution brief. As your Honor can see on the screen, he personally committed the crimes under counts 1 to 6 against 117 to 119 victims. He personally raped 2 victims under counts 7 and 8. He personally committed acts of sexual violence against 12 victims under counts 9 and 10. He personally committed murder and attempted murder against 24 victims under counts 11 and 12. He personally enslaved 97 victims under count 13. he personally committed acts of persecution against 23 victims on political grounds under count 14, against 76 victims on religious grounds under count 15, against 12 victims on national, ethnic, and/or racial grounds under count 16, and against 78 victims on gender grounds under count 17. He committed these acts with the requisite intent and knowledge. His intention to engage in the conduct underlying the crimes he directly carried out, and his intention to cause the consequences of that conduct, or his knowledge that those consequences would occur in the ordinary course of events, are unmistakable and evident by many factors, including, first, his use of weapons, tools, torture devices, and techniques specifically designed to cause the intended harm. Second, the compound nature of his criminal acts, with which he often targeted the same victim. His criminal acts were rarely in isolation. His beating were often coupled with restraining and suspension, or with insults and threats, or with forcing the victims into a stressed position, and in many instances, with shooting the victims with a firearm. Third, as shown in many examples, his criminal acts were often associated with statements revealing not only the intent to commit the crimes, but also the zeal with which he committed them. Finally, his intent and knowledge are evident by the number of years over which he carried out these criminal acts as part of an overall pattern of institutionalized mistreatment and abuse of detainees and other persons in their custody or control. I now turn to the last mode of liability in my presentation, indirect perpetration. Through his direct control over the women's section that we demonstrated in the first half of my presentation, as well as his general authority and influence over the prison, Hishri controlled and used the perpetrators whom he allowed to access this section to commit crimes against women, girls, and young children held in that section. In particular, he used them to impose and maintain the system of mistreatment and torture of these victims, including to commit acts of sexual violence, enslavement, and persecution. With his direct authority over the women's section, Hishri controlled the guards, enslaved detainees, and other Metega perpetrators who could only access this section with his permission and under his control. In this way, he subjugated them to his will to commit the crimes. This is clear, for example, in the instance where he ordered the strip search of female detainees while he was watching. Witness P943 described that the detainee conducting the strip search was clearly, quote unquote, afraid of him. Witness P665 stated she could not blame the detainee conducting the strip search because she had to obey Hishri's orders. I refer your honors to paragraphs 68 and 202 in our brief. These examples clearly demonstrate that Khalid Hishri, through his authority, controlled the actions of the direct perpetrators, who had no choice but to submit to his will. Madam President, your honors, on the evidence of this case, the prosecution requests that the chamber confirm all the crimes charged based on each of the alleged modes of liability and commit this case to trial. This brings me to the end of my presentation, and with this, the prosecution concludes its submission on the merits. Thank you very much, Your Honor.
Judge Martag. Thank you very much, Mr. Morad. Before we move to our luncheon, I now turn to the representative of the Office of the Public Counsel for Victims, and then to defense. to understand exactly the allotted time for the oral submissions and basically how we're going to organize ourselves for our afternoon session. Madam Pellet? Ms. Pellet, thank you very much, Your Honour. The legal representatives of victims will not be making submissions to the merits. Thank you. Judge Martok, thank you very much, Ms. Pellet. I turn now to the defence. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. Hassan took, I think, 45 to 50 minutes in his opening yesterday. We will be sure to use no more than the 4 hours that have been allotted to us. Our intention is to start after the luncheon adjournment, with Your Honour's leave, given the hour. Yes, I mean, I can start, but 5 minutes seems not really worth it. So if Your Honour is content, I'll start after the lunch adjournment. But we obviously won't finish today.
Judge Martok, thank you very much. All right, so now we will move to the luncheon adjournment, and we shall resume in an hour and a half time at 1:30 p.m. hearing from the defence, and I note the attendance in the body of the court of Mr. El Hishri. Thank you very much, and we shall see each other after the luncheon adjournment this afternoon. Thank you.
All right, we will.